Ooh. Ooh. Nice. Something I've noticed is that a lot of people are using the word isekai to refer to any fantasy series, and I'm not entirely sure if that's a particularly helpful thing to do. So, as a result, what I want to do is I want to talk about, or at least I want to briefly introduce 12 terms that are often used in databases by authors and on blogs to describe a lot of the things that oftentimes end up being in isekai, but they aren't necessarily isekai. And so what I want to do here is I want to start some kind of frame of reference upon which people can sort of build off of, or they can go off and look for using some of these terms, because these are not terms that I've made up. These are terms that are already in use. Some of them are going to be really broad, but others are going to be pretty specific. Some are tags, whereas others are entire ideas all on their own. And as a result, it's very important to kind of consider how these might intersect. None of these are unique to isekai, and therefore they should be tackled on their own terms. But my hope here is that by looking at these in regards to how we might think of isekai, we can see what is the same, what is different. As such, in this case, we're looking at things that oftentimes show up in isekai, but are not unique to them. Additionally, all of the examples here are going to be from things that are not isekai. And my hopes here is to sort of situate how we might think of these when they do show up. So, in this case, let's talk about quote-unquote isekai and some of the terms that might be here. 1. Orijinaru senki. These are stories where warfare is the central motivator of both the plot and the world building, where war is an integral element to what the world presents. And as a result, one of the things that's important about original senki is that it doesn't necessarily have to involve somebody jumping over, but it might oftentimes do. A-Kun no Sensou, for instance, is a really early isekai coming out in the early 2000s that kind of captures this particular sentiment. But there's a lot of them that don't have that. 2. Narou. Narou and Narou-kei oftentimes refer to a very specific kind of story, particularly ones revolving around really strong cheat-powered characters and people who kind of gravitate to that particular character. There's a distinction that has to be made here, because it's not every single thing that comes out of Shousetsu ga Narou, but rather a tendency of stories. Narou-kei usually refers to amateur works where we have a strong character who is surrounded by a large cadre of supporters. This does not necessarily mean that everything on Shousetsu ga Narou is considered Narou-kei, and additionally, this does not necessarily mean that everything that is considered Narou-kei is actually from Shousetsu ga Narou, but it usually refers to a specific kind of storytelling. 3. Genjitsu ni atta fushigi na hanashi. Genjitsu ni atta essentially refers to fantasy in reality. It refers to stories where fantasy elements exist within our world, or within a quote-unquote real world, and thus it has to be unveiled. And so in this case, a fantastical element or a phantasmagorical element is fundamentally tied with a sense of the real. Number 4. Musou. Musou refers to stories where you have a singular character who is incredibly overpowered relative to everybody around them. This is usually a little bit different from Narou in that Musou can oftentimes refer to a set of extremely powerful central characters, but not necessarily in the way in which Narou usually revolve around them. Musou in this case usually refer to generals or extremely strong individuals who make decisions. In this case, it refers to being unparalleled, and it definitely reflects that. 5. Zamaa. Zamaa are revenge stories, stories where the protagonist or somebody has been screwed over, and what they do is they bounce back, but they oftentimes bounce back in an incredibly amoral or immoral ways. This is not necessarily always the case, but Zamaa stories usually revolve around some kind of comeuppance against somebody who's done the hero or heroes wrong. 6. Danjon. Danjon-kei stories are very simple. They're stories in which worlds revolve around roguelike mechanics or the idea of dungeon diving. And thus, in this case, they oftentimes refer to game-like stories or very gamey stories, but these game-like elements are played entirely straight within this fantasy world. 7. VRMMO-kei. VRMMO-kei are stories where characters tend to spend a lot of time, most of their time, in virtual realities, and oftentimes those are going to be MMOs. This can lead to isekai. For instance, the New Gate is one such situation where the main character, or a lot of times the characters, are trapped in a VR game, and then by beating the game, they are transmitted or transferred over to another real world. But in the most case, VRMMO-kei refers to stories where characters are in the VR world. 8. Dennou sekai. Dennou sekai refers to computer worlds, where the soul or the brain of the protagonist or protagonists are trapped in a computer world. This is slightly different from VRMMO-kei, where VRMMO-kei oftentimes presumes that it's largely by choice. But dennou sekai implies that oftentimes choice is not a factor, that there's some other element that keeps them there, and they're kind of stuck there. When I talked to Hirotenki, a world customized creator, he calls Sword Art Online dennou sekai. Nariagari. Nariagari refers to upstarts, characters who will upturn or change a pre-existing ideological, political, or social structure simply by the basis that their common sense is different from the common sense of this other world. That there's something going on with this world that doesn't make sense to them, and them simply existing and operating upturns the common sense that already exists in this other place. 10. Kenkokuki. Kenkokuki are stories where countries are being built. They're stories where somebody, the protagonist usually, decides to create a small group. A group then turns into a tribe then turns into a community then turns into communities, and communities then turn into nations. And oftentimes these nations will brush up against others. And from here, Kenkokuki oftentimes brush up into other types, oftentimes orijinaru senki or Nariagari. 11. Gotsugoushugi. Gotsugoushugi are stories where a character is aware or has been made aware of a particular kind of advantage, upon which they take advantage. Gotsugoushugi are stories largely where somebody is opportunistic, and they're opportunistic because they're aware or capable in some particular way that somebody is unable to account for. Oftentimes this can be time traveling, or they have some particular kind of power, or there is some sort of reset ability that is inherent. Oftentimes this can involve, for instance, modern information from Isekai, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Time stories are incredibly important in this context, because oftentimes characters will go backwards or forwards in time, and then they'll use the knowledge that they have from their era to gain a leg up. Number 12. Fantaji. Fantaji is used all the time, and there's absolutely nothing wrong to use the word fantasy to refer to fantasy. It's kind of simple and straightforward, so there's no reason why you shouldn't use that at all. So these are some of the ways in which we can talk about stories that kind of feel like isekai, but they're not actually isekai, and this distinction is really important. When we want to study and think about isekai, we do have to question, well, what about isekai on the basis of it as isekai makes it something worth noting, makes it something worth picking out? And the ways in which we can think about how to understand this particular kind of set of elements is important, because this is really necessary. Oftentimes they do interlap and interlock with a lot of other things. But if we want to be a little bit more precise and a little bit more careful about what it is we're looking at, and what it is, what kind of claims we're making, then we gotta see, well, what is it about isekai that makes it isekai? And at this stage, It's the jump over. If there's no jump over, then there's no point in calling it isekai. And in this case, if we're not going to take the effort to try and figure out what are the other words being used to describe these particular set of mechanics, then all we're doing is just muddying up the waters with potentially bad research. Of course, unless you don't care about that. And all you want to do is just make money. Then I guess you could just call everything isekai. Okay, wow, that came off a lot more passive-aggressive than I thought it would be. Oof. Anyhow, while the credits are rolling, I'm just going to be answering patron questions. So, Lord Liquid Bacon II says, what is your favorite alcoholic beverage? It's a wine called Black Cellar. It's not very good, but it is pretty cheap, and it kind of just goes with everything. Austin Garcia asks, if you had to choose an era of media you enjoy the most, which era would that be? Feel free to define era as makes the most sense to you. I really love the early 2000s anime field. So things like Ichigo 100%, the Please series, Horomatic, like that specific time period I really, really love.